Erev Tov, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School in New York City and our 14 community partners and other organizational partners around the United States of America, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our second Community Shemitah Beit Midrash. My name is Rabbi Yonah Berman, and I have the pleasure of hosting tonight's event. We will have in a moment the opportunity to meet our speaker, Rabbi Hyim Shafner. But first, I'd like to take a moment to thank our partners for being with us tonight. Thank all of you for taking the time on this post-clock change evening for being with us. And first, to invite you to take advantage of the closed captioning, which is available by pressing the CC button at the bottom or top of your screens. To let you know as well that ASL interpretation will be taking place throughout tonight's program, generously sponsored by the Aronson family. We thank them for their support. I'd like to thank our community partners for being with us tonight. Darchei Noam in Minneapolis, Base Abe in St. Louis, The Bayit in Riverdale, Kilat Pardes in Rockville, Maryland, Beth Tefillah in Baltimore, Skokie Valley Agudath Jacob in Chicago, Netivot Shalom in Baltimore, ASBI in Chicago, Moses Montefiore Anshe Emunah in Baltimore, the South Philadelphia Shtibel in Philadelphia, Congregation Beth Shalom in Providence, Rhode Island. And I know that Rabbi Barry Dollinger is hosting a watch party right now in his basement and encourage others to hold similar COVID-safe affairs when they feel that they can. I also want to welcome Beth Israel in Berkeley, Hebrew Institute of White Plains, and finally, Kesher Israel Congregation in Washington, D.C. Of course, we're hosting your rabbi tonight. Thank you for sharing him with us. And we do have the opportunity tonight to learn with Rabbi Hyim Shafner. Rabbi Shafner has been the rabbi at Kesher Israel for 4 years now, since August of 2017. Prior to coming to Kesher Israel, Rabbi Shafner served as rabbi of Base Abraham, Base Abe in St. Louis, another one of our community partners, where he was the rabbi for 13 years, as well as the campus rabbi for some of that time at St. Louis Hillel at Wash U for 8 years. Rabbi Shafner was also a rabbi in India under the auspices of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. He has smicha and a master's in social work and an MA in Jewish philosophy, all from Yeshiva University. He also holds a certificate in advanced psychodynamic psychotherapy. That is a tongue twister, from the St. Louis Psychoanalytic Institute. Rabbi Shafner is the author of the Everything Jewish Wedding Book, as well as many articles in the area of Talmudic narrative, Jewish law and thought, and community building and vision. And I will say that I see Rabbi Shafner as a rabbi's rabbi, someone with vast wisdom, vast understanding, and really someone that many of us in the field, in the rabbinate, turn to when we want to have the opportunity to think, to grow, and to learn from someone who's seen a lot and is able to share so much wisdom with the rest of us. And Rabbi Shafner, tonight you're speaking about not current thinkers on Shemitah, not even going back to Rav Kook, but going back earlier than that, thinking about people as we're entering the Zionist era, 100, 150, 200 years ago, and thinking about Shemitah, this mitzvah tluya ba'aretz, this Israel mitzvah, thinking about what is this as we enter the land, as we rebuild the land, as we dream, what's this going to be that we're going to be doing in this land, these ideas coming up. And these Zionist dreamers, these Zionist thinkers are considering what it is that Shemitah is going to be. What were they thinking about, Rabbi Shafner? Just unmute yourself and we're all yours. Great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Berman. Thank you to Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. It's so wonderful to see so many old friends here on the Zoom. Current folks from Washington, from St. Louis, and from so many places, people I know and respect so much. During COVID, everybody says, has there been anything positive for you out of COVID? And obviously there's been, terrible things for the world and for so many. One of the small things that did come out for me for COVID that was something positive was that at the beginning of COVID, for about 20 minutes a day, I began teaching. I originally was doing it because people wanted to do it kind of in lieu of Kaddish. And I started by teaching the first rabbi of Kesher Israel. Rabbi Silverstone was the rabbi in Washington in 1911. And after studying his works, he wrote a lot. He was a Haredi rabbi from Europe, but wrote a lot about Zionism. He was a very strong Zionist. Reminded me actually a little bit of Rabbi Abraham McGency, who was in St. Louis for many, many years and was also a European Rav, such a strong Zionist. And from that, I began teaching the early Zionist rabbis and then the anti-Zionist rabbis in Europe. And I've been kind of learning with the same small group of folks every morning. And it's really been wonderful for me. I want to give them credit, about 7 or 8 of them. And we've been meeting for about a year and a half. And so when YCT gave me this opportunity to teach about Shemitah, it's really this group of rabbis that I've been focusing on from the late 19th century. Shemitah is something I hadn't really looked into directly, but that I started to a few weeks ago. It very much fits with where they're all coming from. Obviously, the mid to late 19th century is a time of tremendous upheaval. It's the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is strong. The first Reform synagogues in Germany, begin in 1820. Second one in 1844, and then the Reform movement's beginning to grow. In Hungary, where it's a much more Haredi environment, it's not necessarily the Reform movement, but rather something akin to it, what's often called the neologues. So it's a time when there's just so much going on. Everybody's trying to figure out different ways to deal with modernism, the modern world. You now have in the mid 19th century, you have the camera, you have the steam train, you have the railroad. I mean, these are, we take these things for granted and we don't think about them and how life-changing they are. But it changes everything. I mean, what does it mean when all of a sudden people have been praying for thousands of years to go back to Israel, and now there's a steam train and a boat? And for the first time, there are Jews in the world like Baron Rothschild who have not only political power, but money. And they have the money. Rabbi Kalisher, one of the really important early mid 19th century Zionists, who's Orthodox, he writes to Baron Rothschild in the 1850s and says, you need to buy the land of Israel. You could do it. It doesn't cost very much. And there's some farmers there. Just buy the land. And initially, Baron Rothschild doesn't think it's such a great idea. Eventually, by the 1880s, he is doing that, and he's settling what gets called in all the halachic literature the colonists, the colonies. It's Petach Tikva, it's Zichron Yaakov. They're growing grapes. They're growing, and kind of a combination, right? Just like some people are dealing with modernism by Reformation, and others are dealing with it like Chassam Sofer by pulling back and being and others like the Chassam Sofer are pulling back and are saying, Chodesh Asur min Torah, everything that's new is forbidden from the Torah. We need to completely withdraw. So there's another way to deal with modernism in the late 19th century, which is nationalism. Nationalism is spreading everywhere. It's very important for people. In fact, at some point, I think Rabbi Kalisher, Rabbi Reines, the early Mizrahi, they write, everybody has their own nation now, the Italians and the English, and why shouldn't the Jews hit that? Why shouldn't the Jews have their own nation? And so there's so much going on, and Jews start in the early 1880s to begin to settle in the land of Israel and to work the land, and that's new. There have been Jews living in, obviously for thousands of years, Jews were living in cities in the land of Israel. Really in 4 major cities, in Tzfat, in Tiberia, the 4 holy cities, Tzfat, Tiberia, Jerusalem, and Hebron, also in Jaffa. And there are Haredi kollels, what's called the kollels. There's the Hungarian kollel, the Polish kollel, and what that means is there are groups in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. They're learning Torah in Jerusalem and Hebron, and they're being supported by Jews in Eastern Europe, and they're not working the land. Of course, what they're doing is, they're buying food from the local Arabs who are growing food there, And it's fine. Everything's fine. There were Sephardim living in Israel at the time, and the relationships between the Arabs and the Sephardim are actually very, very close. The mayors of Jerusalem in the late 1800s are sometimes Arabs, sometimes Jews. That's how it was. These, Haredi kollels are studying Torah, keeping to themselves, buying food. Jews are not working the land. Part of the new movement of Zionism is of course different. It's both secular Zionists who are beginning to emerge, and it's religious Zionists who are starting to think about Israel in a different way. Starting to think about Israel not just as a place to study Torah, but as a place that, we have the political power to be in Israel. We can get there now. Maybe we need to. There's a growing sense of Zionism, and it's not just a Zionism of we're waiting for the Messiah, or a Zionism of I want to dwell in a holy spot in Israel and study Torah. It's a Zionism of I want to work the land. And most of these folks are coming from what later becomes Mizrahi, Rabbi Kashu, Rabbi Reines, people who are open to these ideas, and it's combined with folks who they're not anti-religious, but they're Zionists in the secular sense. And secular Zionism in the early 1880s has not yet really found its way. It's before the first Zionist Congress, I think. And there is one exception to all of this, and that's a fascinating rabbi who I hope we'll get to tonight. Probably deserves a separate lecture, a year of lectures, and that is Rabbi Akibio Schlesinger. He is a second generation student of the Chassam Sofer, very much a Haredi, but he's also a radical, and he writes an entire book. He moves to Jerusalem in 1870, and he writes an entire book called Lahachzir, the group that's going to return the crown to its place. And what he envisions is a utopian Haredi society in Israel. And he doesn't believe in taking money from Europe. He believes that you have to work the land in Israel. And he has a very tight system for how the society is going to function. And by the time he finishes with this 100-page book, which I studied with my small group, what you realize is he has constructed a country, because you can't have a vision of thousands of people in Israel studying Torah and not taking money from Europe and working the land, and not have police, and not have a fire department, and not have a way of structuring the community, and not have a way of voting, and not have and he begins to create a kind of Zionist democracy, but he's a Haredi, and he doesn't call it that. And in fact, today, strangely enough, scholars say that both the Neturei Karta and the Mizrahi, in a certain sense, emerge from the same person. And that's Rabbi Akibio Schlesinger, who he called himself the Ivri. That's an acronym for his name. So I'm hoping that we'll get to him, but we'll see. So what I want to do is I want to focus on a watershed year, and that was 1889. In 1889, this is the first year that Jews are really working the land. Again, it's Baron Rothschild who's really paid to settle them. And now the question of Shemitah comes up. 1889 is a Shemitah year. In 1881, 82, when it was a Shemitah year, there were very few Jews working the land. It really was not an issue yet. There was one Jew that's written about in halachic literature who's living near Hebron, and he sells his land for the year to an Arab there, and it doesn't cause much of a ruckus at all, because it applies to almost nobody. But 7 years later, in 1880, 88, 89, this becomes a moment when now hundreds of people are working the land in just these 5 or 6 years that have gone by. Because Baron Rothschild has settled them. He's bought the land in Zichron Yaakov, in Petach Tikva, in Gedera. And now hundreds of what they call in the literature, again, colonists, are working the land. And now the question is, Jews really are settled in Israel. They really are Jewish farmers. And the question is, what's going to happen? Right now it's 1888. What's going to happen next year in 1889 when it's a sabbatical year? Are we going to be able to work the land? Are we going to have a biblical sabbatical in which we're not going to work the land at all? Is that going to be okay? Is it going to have to be 2 years? Because maybe a sale of 1 year isn't really so legitimate. Is this like selling chametz, or does this need to be a sale that is legal in the courts of the Ottoman Empire? What kind of, and is that going to be okay? Who's going to work this land? If we sell this land to Arabs, are they going to work? Are they going to come into our places and work the land? Do we feel safe about that? Or are Jews going to work it? And if Jews are going to work it, is that halachically permitted? Is this even is it a good idea? Right. One question is halachic. Is it okay? Is the heter mechira, selling the land to a non-Jew so we can work it on the sabbatical year? Is that halachically permitted? Is that theologically a good idea? I mean, what about the fact that if this is the new era, kind of messianic era, then the Torah says if you don't keep the sabbatical year, you'll be exiled from the land. I mean, maybe not keeping the sabbatical totally flies in the face of what it means to live on the land now in the modern era, to be a people living on the land. How could you not keep the sabbatical? That's everything. Or is it that, we're not there yet. We got to make this project work. This project doesn't work on a practical level. Everything's going to fall apart. We have hundreds of people. Maybe they're going to starve. Maybe everybody's going to, maybe this won't be the beginning of the redemption that we hope. So while rabbis in the 1850s, very early on, the first thing that occurs to them maybe are sacrifices in the land of Israel, because they've been waiting thousands of years to go. By the 1880s, it's totally different. People are really settling in the land. So I want to take a look at some of the halachic literature, some of the letters that are sent back and forth between rabbis and also Baron Rothschild, and to get a sense of what's really happening on the ground. Let me see if are there any. If you have any questions, you can put them in the text, and I will try and take them. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Here we go. Okay. So a little bit of the halachic background, right? There's the Gemara. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin that there was an issue of arnonia. There was some kind of tax that was being put upon the Jewish people, and that if they didn't work the land on the sabbatical year, this would be very problematic for the Jews. They would not be able to pay this tax that was being demanded of them by non-Jews. And so at first, there's a statement in the Talmud that if you don't keep the sabbatical year, perhaps you're not a good witness. But when it came, this arnonia emerged with this heavy tax that was a burden on the Jewish people, that Rabbi Yanai proclaimed, go out and sow the seeds during the sabbatical year due to the arnonia that you have to pay. One time this happened, and people did that, and the sages said, even though you have worked the land on the sabbatical year, because it was due to this terrible tax that was being put on the Jewish people, you are considered a good witness. That was not sort of sinful. So there's some argument.
Rabbi Shafner, sorry, can I just ask you to full screen your, if you can, your share? And yeah, you can do that. You can also hit under view. You can make it sort of so we don't see the tabs and everything else. I'll just give people more screen space to see what's going on.
View. Your screen sharing more. Let's see. View.
There's you see where that says 100%? There's a little arrow there. If you pop that down.
Is that on the top here?
Yeah, under insert and view in the menu, you see there's like that 100% button.
You're seeing my screens, right? So
yeah, I see your screen. Yeah.
Am I near it?
I can't see your cursor, unfortunately.
Oh,
go to the left. Go to the left. More to the left. You keep going to the left. There you go. Right, just under where you are. You see the 100%? Under where you are. See, it says 100. Yeah.
Oh, here we go.
There. Yeah. Click on that. Not the zoom, but click on the little arrow there and hit maybe. Try fit. You could try that and see if that works a little too. But okay. Okay. Yeah, that should do it. Okay. People can see a little clearer now.
There we go.
Okay, thanks. Great. Perfect.
You could see it now?
Yep.
Okay. Great. Okay. The so Rashi says here, Shvi'it bizman hazeh derabbanan, the Batla Kedushas Haaretz. So Rashi says the reason that they were being allowed to work it on the sabbatical year is that Shemitah today, since there's no temple, is rabbinic. Tosfot says no, actually Shemitah is biblical. So why was it permitted due to the Arnonia, due to this tax? The answer is it was pekuach nefesh. The Rambam in two different places seems to say different things. And the Kesef Mishnah commentary on the Rambam kind of concludes from the Rambam that the Rambam held that it was biblical, but then the Kesef Mishnah, as a commentary on the Rambam, is Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and in his book, the Beit Yosef, kind of says the opposite. He says, it actually seems from the Rambam that it's rabbinic, that Shemitah is rabbinic, and so how to understand the Rambam, whether Shemitah is rabbinic or biblical, how to understand the Gemara, is Shemitah rabbinic or biblical, is Machloket Rashi and Tosfot. How to understand the Rambam is actually a difference of opinion of the same person, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, in two different books that he wrote. So it's not like we're dealing with something that's black and white. Part of the question of the heter mechira, of the permission to sell the land to non-Jews, is going to be dependent on the question of whether this is something rabbinic or something biblical. As you could see in Rashi, that if it was rabbinic, there would be room for perhaps even working the land. So let's look at the first heter mechira. The heter mechira is published in several places. This is a newspaper called Hamelitz. It's a terrific resource. You can actually access it for free, just in a couple of clicks on the Hebrew University Library website. And it was a Zionist magazine published in Russia in the late 19th century, and it's not secular, it's not religious, it's kind of both. I think the lines between secular and religious were, in a certain sense, things are even stronger lines in those days, but in another sense, there's a lot of crossover, and so it gets widely publicized. The first heter mechira, which is about the upcoming sabbatical in 1889. And there are three rabbis that sign. And they write as follows: since the sabbatical year is coming, according to the way that Maimonides counted the sabbatical years, and it's coming up in Tafresh Mem Tet, 1889, and we have merited that now we have many colonists, Shel Yedidim. We have many dear colonists who are being supported by Baron Rothschild in order to work the ground, and so v'imnesar alehem l'shaderta adama l'takenet hakramim. We don't let them keep the land in good shape, and so it may destroy all of the work that has been done to settle these colonists. This is the language of the heter mechira, and this is really hatzalat teguf, hatzalat mamon. It's a saving of body, kuach nefesh, and a saving of finances, meaning a rescue of finances. But heter al shana. So therefore, we declare a heter, a permission for this year, 1889, limkor b'kayitz, to sell during the summer. All of the fields that the Jewish people are working, to sell them to non-Jews, on condition that the lands will be returned afterwards. Right? Part of the issue is going to be: is this a real sale or not? Right? If this is a real sale, are you allowed to sell the land to non-Jews? Do you trust that they'll return it to you? And if it's not a real sale, well then, if it's not a real sale, who says it really works? In order that you can to get around Shemitah, right? That's going to be part of the underlying issue. But here, this is the heter mechira being written by a bezdin, and these are the factors that they're taking into account. In other words, right, you can already feel the tension. Like, this is the first sabbatical year ever in 2,000 years. What are we going to do? Are we going to have faith in God that God is going to do what God promised in the Torah to give us double in the 6th year, triple in the 6th year? Are we Are we going to just, have faith and keep the sabbatical in a biblical way? Or are we worried about the practical side? Well, you could imagine if you lived in 1889 and it was the first time that Jews were working the land, you would probably feel a little bit of both, right? On the one hand, like maybe, I don't know, maybe it's not the Messianic era yet. Maybe we can't really trust that God's going to really do these miracles for us. And there's a heck of a lot riding on it. On the other hand, what does it mean to violate Shemitah, the first year that we're plowing the ground, that we're working the land in Israel in a kind of, quasi-messianic utopian return to the land? So there's a lot of emotions underlying all of this and a lot of theology underlying all of this. So these rabbis, right, Memela Muvan Shot the Kalu. So it's very clear to us that we need to be lenient. And that parenthetically, when they sell the land to the non-Jew, the Jew should not do the work. The non-Jew should. But now there's a problem. If we say that halachically, the Jews who sell their land to the non-Jews should not do the work, what about the poor people? What about the poor, who they don't have the extra money to hire non-Jews to do the work? Right now, here you have this land. So what do? You sell the land to the non-Jew, but you're not necessarily selling it for very much money because it's only for a year. So now, do you actually have the money to hire the non-Jew to work the land? I guess the crops themselves could have been payment, but if the crops themselves are payment, then the Jews are not getting crops. Obviously, there could have been some kind of sharecropper initiative, but Yasub Machaba Atzman. This Bezdin actually said that if you're too poor to hire somebody to do the work, a non-Jew to do the work, you can sell your land to the non-Jew, and you yourself, the Jew, can work that land on the Sabbath year. Bezdin should be Yerushalayim, but they said needs to be in the agreement of the Beit Din in Jerusalem. Who's the Beit Din in Jerusalem? That is Rabbi Shmuel Salant and Rabbi Diskin, and it's kind of a Haredi Bezdin that is not so keen on a combination of secular and religious people working the land. What they're more focused on is the last 50 years of studying Torah in Jerusalem. But nevertheless, they said this needs to be with agreement to the Bezdin in Jerusalem, and they need to be able to draw up the papers for this. And this is only for the sabbatical year of 1889. This is not for the sabbaticals that come afterwards. Then we're going to need a new heter when it comes to that time. And all of this we only do if there's one person that has to agree to all this, and that is Pe'er Dorenu, the illustrious one of our generation, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. Who is Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector? Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector is the greatest posek of the generation. Just like we talk about Rav Moshe Feinstein in the last generation, about whom everybody accepted, that was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector in the late 1800s of Kovna. And so this Bezdin, I'll tell you in a minute who it's made up of, they say all of this we can only do if it's agreed upon by Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. Now, what does it mean to have Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan agree to this heter? What it means is that everybody should be on board. In theory, I think that's what they think. There's 3 rabbis signed on this: Rabbi Shmuel Kotna, and most famously Rabbi Shmuel Molivar of Bialystok. That's a name that we all know. Rabbi Molivar is really the inheritor of the earlier Orthodox Zionists like Rabbi Reines and Rabbi Kalisher. Rabbi Shmuel Molivar is one of the important names because he's a very strong Zionist and very much a Talmid Chacham who's well accepted. He signs as one of the people on this Beit Din. Here is the follow-up from Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan says, I know about these colonists, the Jews, who are being, who are working the lands in the Holy Land, and the Shemitah year is coming up. We know about that. And this is an issue of hundreds of lives that are in the balance. Miodea, who knows, how it's going to turn out if we can't find a solution. And even he says, even though I'm very old right now and I don't have a lot of energy, I have analyzed it halachically, and it is permitted in my mind, he says, to sell to the Yishmaelim, to the Arabs, the land. He says, but you have to sell it for 2 years. 1 year is not enough. After those 2 years, the land has to be returned. That has to be done at least in the summer before. And I have written a small book about this. And he writes that it should be done by non-Jews, the work. But he says if the people are poor, as the Bezdin said, then they can do that. It's true for Hatter Klau. Just like the Bezdin had said, it's a very similar language to that Beit Din. So I think he did see the psak of that Beit Din, and now he's responding to it. Indeed, he says this is only for 1889, and he signs it Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay, so that's where we are at so far. Now, once this heter is spread, there's opposition, of course. And I want to look also at the opposition and some of the language of the opposition. And I think part of the goal is to look at some of the language of the opposition to this heter and to try and get a sense from that of what are the issues at stake? Why are people, we can understand why, this Bezdin of Rabbi Molivar is pro the heter mechira, why Rabbi Yitzchak agrees, because there's a lot riding on this, and there are many perhaps Jewish lives even perhaps at stake. But we can perhaps see from the opposition what all of the issues are that are kind of percolating under the surface. So this is the Meshiv Davar. This is a tshuva that was written at that time, and it's by the Nitziv. Naftali Tziyudu Berlin. I think in his language we can see some interesting hints at what's bothering people about this heter. That this heter mechira, the opposition to the heter mechira, to the permission to sell the land to the non-Jews, is not just a halachic issue. He says, first of all, what's the big deal? Why can't we buy food? Let's leave our lands fallow, and we'll buy food from the colonists. There was a Karen, there was a tzedakah fund that was created in Eastern Europe, actually, to send money to any colonists that were willing to take it, that they could buy food from non-Jews. Not clear it was enough money, but to try and help people keep the sabbatical. Those who dwell outside of the land of Israel. Now, of course, the Nitziv and Untitled Chapter Berlin is very much outside of Israel. He is not in Israel. He is the head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he says those who live outside of Israel, smeichim l'shmoa, they will be so happy to hear that you have been able to fulfill the holiness of the land. And the simchas levavam yodu et Hashem v'etamo, they will thank God and His people, the colonists. Asher yetzu lios chalutzim b'milchemas hachayim tachas shkachas Hashem hapratit ba'artzo. This is a very interesting language, right? We outside in exile, we know you're there. You're working the land. We're going to be so happy that to hear that the colonists have been pioneers in the land. In what? Not in creating a nation there, but in milchemes hachayim tachas hashkachas Hashem, in the war of life under the hashkacha, under the divine providence of God. Hapratit ba'artzo, right? There's a Jewish belief that God's presence is more powerful in the land of Israel, more present in the land of Israel. And therefore, that there'll be more hashkacha pratit. God will guide us. God will do favors for us in the land of Israel. And so, right, part of the opposition here, part of, at least it seems like the Nitziv's, Rabbi Tzvi Berlin's opposition to the Heter Mechira, to the permission to sell land to the non-Jews is a messianic land is not a land in which Jews just work in order to create a nation. It's a land in which God does miracles for us, right? You can see they're coming from very different points of view. One very practical, one very much on the ground, and another one very much a religious position. They're all religious, but more of a spiritual position. Kvar Shamanu, Sher Achar Shenispar B'Tevuas Hasada B'Shana Zu Ashishis Masha Lo Yekain Eser Shanim. And we heard actually that what you got this 6th year, 1887, was much more than you've ever gotten any other year, right? The blessing is coming true. This is the divine providence. And this, obviously, God wants you to do this. Now, I haven't seen that quoted anywhere else, that year was actually so productive. So I'm not sure how true it was. We are giving gifts from those who fear God and guard the Torah. We're sending you money. What does it mean to settle the land? It means to settle the land in shleimut b'ratzon Hashem, fully in the will of God, to keep the Sabbath. We have to believe if we don't keep the sabbatical year, how many terrible things could happen to us. It says it in the Torah, right? The curses in the Torah basically come because the Jews have not kept the sabbatical year. Rav echad ki acham levavo al meos nefesh achenu b'nei Yisrael. We have heard about one rabbi who be'eretz b'hafriz al hamida. We've heard that one rabbi has sent out and written that even if it's biblical, the sabbatical obligation, which was according to Tosfos, that nevertheless you could be lenient. Or maybe that this rabbi thinks it's b'kuach nefesh. Life is in danger. That it's like the case in the Gemara where the king makes them pay taxes. They don't have enough to pay. The king is going to be killed in that case in the Gemara. So, and he says they're comparing, Jews not having enough food today to this time in the temple. He says it's not the same level. Not being able to support yourself well is not called pekuach nefesh. That's called your life being in danger. Your life's not in danger. You'll be able to buy grain from the non-Jews, right? In other words, it's true. Maybe the Jews could have survived. Could they have survived? Maybe they could have. It's a few hundred colonists. Can't do it today, I don't think, but maybe it's true they could have survived, right? What's the other side of the coin? The other side of the coin is this is a big project. This is Jews living in the land, being a nation in the land, right? There's something theological at stake here. It's much more than just, can we do it or can't we? And then there's a series of letters that are sent between Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan Spechter and Rabbi Shmuel Salant. So Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan Spechter, remember, is in Eastern Europe. He's the great posek of Europe who supports the Bezdin's decision, Rabbi Molavar's Bezdin, to use the Heter Mechira. Rabbi Shmuel Salant is the rabbi of the Bezdin in Jerusalem. Remember, the difference between Zichron Yaakov and Petach Tikva, where they're working the land, and Jerusalem, where they've been learning Torah for 50 years in the old city, the difference is enormous, right? The difference is wild. The vision of what Israel is incredibly different. And so Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan is certainly the leading Haredi posek in the world, but Rabbi Shmuel Salant is the rabbi of Jerusalem. And make sure you can see this. I'm going to open up this PDF of letters. Can you see this PDF of letters? It says Mishmeret HaKodesh on the top.
Yes, we can.
So this is about Heter Mechira, and this is a letter from Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan to Rabbi Shmuel Salant. There's a few letters back and forth. I'm just going to do a few lines from them and get a sense of what's going on between them and what the pressures are on these rabbis upon whose shoulders is the entire question, really. So in this letter to Rabbi Shmuel Salant, again, this is right before the sabbatical. This is Tafshin. This is Tafresh Memches, 1888. He says, first of all, it has to be a 2-year sale. And he says, says, in the past, Jews did not have land in Israel. But right now, Jews have land. And, this applies to hundreds of people, right? He says to Rabbi Shmuel Salant, you might want to keep things the status quo. Maybe Chodesh Hashem in the Torah, maybe you feel like the Chassam Sofer that creating a heter is forbidden because it's something new. But he says, times have changed. And this is Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan Spector speaking. It's not like he was a reformer, he's the Posek Ador for the Haredi world. And he says, 7 years ago, it was a totally different story. The Hungarian Kollel was learning in the cities and buying food. That was fine. But now we have hundreds of people working the land. You can't just rely on a miracle that God is going to bring a bracha. This is Teves, Tafresh Memches, right? 1888, Teves. And this is a letter from a letter back to Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan. And this is Rabbi Shmuel Salant's argument against the heter mechira. He says, first of all, if it's a good sale, so then you have a problem because, maybe it's forbidden to sell land to non-Jews. And if you'll say it's not a real sale, it's just a perfunctory sale, well, then it doesn't work. So you're stuck. And then he writes, he says, we know, he says, if you want to sell the land, it needs to be a legal sale. So what does it mean, a legal sale? It needs to be an Ottoman sale. If it's not, then it's nothing. He says, if you want to try and sell the land to non-Jews through the Ottoman courts, you're not going to be able to. And he says, by the way, Baron Rothschild is really opposed to selling the land. Now, that's not entirely true. It may be true that Baron Rothschild didn't want to sell the land. It's also very true that Baron Rothschild wanted them to work the land. That's a very big factor, and you'll see it in some of these letters. Baron Rothschild did not want the land to be fallow.
Rabbi Shafner, I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. This is Hodi Nima stepping in for Rav Yonah Berman. We just wanted to know that we have about 10 minutes left. So this is a great chance for folks to note any questions. I don't know if you're able to see the chat, Rabbi Shafner. There's a couple of questions that have come in.
Pop these up here. Why 2 years? That's a good question. Why 2 years? My sense is that made it a real sale. And that showed it wasn't just a sale. It's interesting. In some of the halachic literature, there's this big question of, is this the same as selling chametz, or is it totally different, right? Our sale of chametz, it's real, but it's also not entirely real. Like we know what it is. But here, this is the first time they're doing such a sale. I think there's a real need to make it a real sale. I think he felt that 2 years is not just a sale for this, it's a bigger picture sale. Isn't selling the land a separate issue than not working land? Yes, and that becomes an argument. Once you sell the land, now are you allowed to work the land? That's it's a separate question. And that you could see that in the heter mechira. They say basically you're not allowed to work the land. Non-Jews have to work the land. Unless you're poor, then we might let you work the land if you can't hire people. Doesn't Netziv know he's opposing Rabbi Yitzchak Spector? I assume he does. I mean, look, Hamelitz it's a big newspaper. I think he not only does he. I mean, you have to show you in the letter. In fact, maybe I'll skip to this letter. There's a letter a few pages later in which Rabbi Yitzchak, poor Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan, everybody like 6 or 7 rabbis gang up on him the rabbis of Jerusalem and others. And people are fighting tooth and nail over this. This is not just the halachic question. That's what I'm trying to say. This is a theological question. This is a big picture question about, are we joining with the secular people when we work the land? What kind of land is this going to be? Is this going to be, remember, working the land at that time, it's not like us, like, working the land's a good way to get food, or working the land's good for the environment. For them, working the land is about being a nation. It's about eventually socialism is going to emerge. Working the land it's theological. It's much more than it is for us. And I'll show you that later. So this is part of the big question: is this an invasion? That's precisely the question, right? The question here is the purpose? Somebody wrote, the purpose of Shemitah to rest the land isn't a temporary sale to non-Jews an invasion? Of course, it's an invasion. Right? In other words, that's the whole point. The question is, are we undermining the whole notion of going back to Israel by selling the land, or just the opposite? Not selling the land would be undermining going back to Israel, because we want it to work practically. Because it's not so clear. You're just trusting God that this is going to work. It might not work, and there's a lot riding on. I'll just show you this letter. It also comes up whether you can trust the Arabs actually to sell the land to come in. So that's what he says. And then he mentions also, he talks a little bit about a meeting he had with Baron Rothschild. Let me show you this letter so then he writes back to Rabbi Shmuel Salant, and he says, listen, you don't need it to be, this is Rabbi Yitzchak. He's basically writing halachically back. He says, you don't need it to be an Ottoman court. It could be a Jewish court. That's what I hold. And you can rely on, it's an interesting question. In other words, are these just halachic points? Or maybe this is a much bigger question of what does the Messianic era look like? I think that's part of what's at stake here. This is a letter to one of the messengers of Baron Rothschild that Yitzchak Hanan writes. And it's interesting. He says, he tries to convince Baron Rothschild Baron Rothschild really is insisting on the heter mechira. He wants them to work the land, but Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan starts to realize how much pressure he's under from other rabbis, and he sort of asks Baron Rothschild. He wants Baron Rothschild to give in. And heter ba'ofen hazeh ulam bein ko shamati ki yatzu ezim aram. I've heard that people are upset about this heter mechira that we've created, and please ask the Baron limkor hamoshavot mechira gemora shtei shanim. Make sure that if we can, the Baron wants us to do this sale. He wants them to work the land, but it's got to be 2 years. He says, I want to make sure that this is done as halachically as possible. And then he says, he says, and he says, really, it'd be better if we didn't use the heter at all, he says to the messenger of Baron Rothschild. It would be better, I think, says Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan. Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan has permitted the heter mechira, but now he says to Baron Rothschild, maybe we should do the Shemitah the way it's supposed to be done and not sell the land. Why is he saying this? Because he's under such intense pressure. Look at this. He writes a letter to Rabbi Shmuel Molivar. This is wild. This is Adar Tafresh Mem Ches, just before the sabbatical. And this is a letter from Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan Spector, Sivan, Tafresh Mem Ches, to Rabbi Shmuel Molivar, right? He was the sort of Zionist Orthodox rabbi who was signed on the Beis Din. And he says, I got a letter from Rabbi Shmuel Salant. Shekosev Kibali Yerushalayim Kodesh Dr. Goldberger. He says that Dr. Goldberger, who's a messenger of Baron Rothschild, came. Hanediv de Paris, the Nediv de Paris, the great tzedakah, Baal Tzedakah of Paris. That's Baron Rothschild. She has a shtar mechira, that's a shvis bezdin sham, that we should use the shtar mechira. Because of Rabbi Gon, Rav Shmuel, and he says Rav Shmuel Salant said, he's not going to agree to this. And he's the rabbi of the Bezdin of Jerusalem. They have to, right? He's sort of stuck, Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan, because the Bezdin of Jerusalem is the group that has to process this. Because any shtar, any document that's not made by the Ottoman in the Ottoman courts, it's not worth anything. And that's what Rav Shmuel Salant said. And I said to him, that's not true. We could do it in a Jewish court. And after that, he says, after that, I got letters from all the rabbis of the Kollel in Jerusalem, of the Prushim. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Hanan. He's calling the Haredi Kollel in Jerusalem Prushim, Pharisees. It's unbelievable. Bezdin said, he said there were 17 rabbis signed on it. And they're so they're screaming at me that I made a heter to sell the land for the 7 people. And they're rebuking me. They're telling me that it's really not a pekuach nefesh issue. It's not an issue of lives being at stake. He says, and now I got a letter from Goldberg, who's the messenger of the Baron. That the Baron is sending me messages that Rabbi Shmuel Salant doesn't want to agree at all to this. They don't want to rely on any heter. Just like is usually their way. That's what he says about the Bezdin in Jerusalem. He says, this is how they are. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Spector speak. It's unbelievable. Because of Dr. Goldberg, it's amazing that he sees this in such a wide way. And Dr. Goldberg said the Bezdin of the Ashkenazim is not agreeing at all to this, but the Bezdin of the Sephardim is agreeing to this. And he says to Rabbi Shmuel Moller, he says, we are going to be stepping into enormous machlokas. Gedola, God forbid, he says. This is going to tear apart the Jew. 1889 Shemitah is going to tear apart the Jewish people. We don't think about this at all, but it was enormous. Ishli tsar mi says, I have such pain. I didn't imagine this, he says, when we stepped into this a year ago. Diskin is signed on it. It's like all these rabbis are, you could just, the pressure that Rabbi Yitzchak Spector is under, he's not a young man at this time, just wild.
Rabbi Shafner, since time is running low, I guess I'm wondering, you've, in a truly fascinating fashion, laid this all out for us. As you immersed yourself in these Mekorot, what were you convinced by? Did you find yourself drawn to someone over another, one argument over another?
Good question. I'll tell you, the secret to studying things I found from the 19th century is putting yourself in their shoes. That it's very hard to put yourself in. You have to do it. In other words, when it comes to, even if it's, early Zionist rabbi writing about, the return of sacrifices, like you have to put yourself in their shoes. To us, that might sound strange, but if for thousands of years you've been praying to go back to Israel and all of a sudden there's a steamboat, like, of course you're going to think about sacrifices and you're going to write halakhically about that. Or, for instance, late 19th century issues like, forbidding everything the Reform do, right? The Reform put the bima up at the front and they have a mechitza. The Reform synagogue in 1844 in Hamburg, I was just looking at a picture of it. They had a balcony for women. Men and women didn't sit together in the early Reform synagogues, but they could see each other. It was a balcony, like they have in Mishal here in Washington. And so the rabbis of Hungary got together and they said, a significant group of Haredi rabbis got together and said, it's usher for any Orthodox Jew to enter a synagogue where you can see the women through the mechitza. Why did they say that? They said that because, right, you have to put yourself in their shoes. They're responding to the Reform movement. The world is falling apart. It's what you see, I think, is that history of halacha is not just, we sometimes imagine that halacha is robotic and just logical. And, it's rabbis like Spock who are just, making halacha. But of course, it's not true. It's not how it's supposed to be. It's always within historical and sociological context. And it's not a bad thing. That's how it's supposed to be. I mean, that doesn't make it illegitimate, but that's precisely, of course, what's happening in 1889 when so much is at stake on both sides. There are arguments, valid halachic arguments on both sides, but even more so, I think you see very clearly that it's impacted by how they see the world and what happens at the very early stages of this Zionist, this Zionist, reimagining is going to condition things for the future. I don't know what would have happened if in 1889 nobody had followed the Heter Mechira. Shul Slant had won out, and all you had was later on Oter Bez created by the Chazon Ish. So I don't know. Would it split the secular and religious even more than it is now? Would there be enough food? Who knows what would. Or maybe it would have been better for us to have more faith and nobody worked the land, and maybe something else would have emerged. Very interesting questions, but I think all of these things sort of underlie much deeper questions. That I think one thing to take away from this is that halacha doesn't only exist in the present. Who we are as Jews is built on the past, and what I found studying it is really very instructive in terms of shedding light on who we are as Jews. Thank you all. That's very funny, Colin. Yeah, it'd be nice. That's what we can talk about this on our Thanksgiving. That'd be good.
Hi, sorry, I'm having Rabbi Shafner, can you give me a thumbs up that someone can hear me? Thank you. Okay, I'm having some Zoom issues here, so I'm walking away from my computer. I want to thank you very, very much. This is fascinating, interesting, and I think the excitement really that the early Zionist thinkers, the Rabbanim that we met tonight, were thinking about is something which is palpable today as well. As people in Chutz La'aretz, who in many cases, those of us who are here have not celebrated Shemitah in person, have not thought about Shemitah, and here we are imagining Shemitah just as they were in many ways for the first time. And also that idea of the secular religious divide, but also coming together. We're religious people, we're thinking about secular values, bringing this together, and we're at the same time people who are in certain ways coming from a secular bent and thinking about the larger world and what does that mean in terms of Shemitah. And we're really going to see that in our next conversation as well with Rabbi Yafa Epstein, thinking about the idea of Shmitat Ksafim with 4 weeks from tonight when we meet her on December 5th. So I want to thank you, Rabbi Shafner. I want to thank our interpreters tonight, both for doing ASL and closed captioning, Rabbi Hodi Nimis for jumping in and being our moderator tonight when I couldn't help out because of some tech issues that I was having. And most of all, everyone else is here tonight for learning with us, for staying up late, especially on the East Coast. And we look forward to seeing you again in a month. Thank you all so much for being with us. Have a wonderful few weeks ahead. Laila Tov.
Great learning with you. I did post in the chat a link to it, but if anybody wants the text sheet and can't get it off the chat, feel free to email me.
Okay. Thank you all so much. Laila Tov.